There's a smile.
Hello. My name is Lena Rizkallah. I'm a proud first-generation Palestinian American. I wrote everything out because I don't want to lose the detail. And I'd like to share a couple of thoughts about how I feel about Palestine today. And I'm going to start by telling you a quick story. So one of my, can you hear me? Can you guys hear me in the back? How about now?
Your diaphragm.
Okay. So I'm going to tell you a quick story. One of my earliest memories was when I was a little girl. I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, and I was playing with my older brother, Assam, who was a real jerk to this day, but I still love him. And we were playing, and he was teasing me, and he grabbed my toy out of my hand and wouldn't give it back to me. And I argued, and I finally went to my mother, and I was crying to her with my crocodile tears. I said, "Mom, Assam took my toy." And she's like, "Khalas, Lena, it's okay." And I'm like, "It's not okay. He took my toy, and it's not fair." And my mother, who's a Palestinian refugee, got on her knees, and she wiped away my tears, and maybe she spat on her hand and fixed my hair or something. And she said, Yalina, life is not fair. There is no justice. Now remember, I was 5. But this was my mother's experience as an immigrant, as a refugee. There was no reason to sugarcoat anything for her, even if I was just 5. And to be honest, I've never forgotten that moment and the truth, and it's resonated in my life, throughout my life. And it's awkward because I'm also Palestinian American, and being an American means living with the confidence that when I put my head down to sleep at night, the only thing I have to worry about is maybe a bad dream, or maybe the AC is loud, or maybe my dog is hogging too much of the bed. As an American, I can travel freely throughout the US, the world. I can work, build a career, earn money. I can send my imaginary kids to whatever school I want if I can afford it. As an American, I have an expectation and a right to peace and equality and justice. But on the other hand, I'm the daughter of the Palestinian diaspora. My mother is a Palestinian refugee born in a small town about 20 minutes from Haifa, and my father was an immigrant from Ramallah. In 1948, when my mother was about 6, she had to flee her hometown, and her parents and 2 sisters had to leave because the Zionists had come, and they went to Beirut, and that's where they stayed. My grandparents were planning to return with their family, but they never did. For so many reasons, being a Palestinian of the diaspora and an American is disorienting. I grew up feeling very different from other kids at school, not just because of my Arab fro and unibrow, my hummus sandwiches, and the fact that maybe sometimes my dad picked me up from school in his dishasha. People I knew since kindergarten would ask me, "Where are you from, Lena? Where are you really from?" And it would take me like 20 minutes to explain that I was from Palestine and that you can't find it on a map. I felt different because while I felt the security of America, it didn't jive with the experiences of my parents and the history of my family in Palestine. From a young age, I understood that sure, everyone deserves freedom and justice, but not everybody gets it. I grew up over the last few decades watching the occupation unfold, the Israeli state broadening its control over the land and resources, and its power and influence expanding over the world. We watched as its ideologies infiltrated the media, education, churches, world history, and culture. Sorry, it's long. We watched helplessly, infuriated, as religious Jewish families from Brooklyn could move into a Palestinian's 150-year-old home and squat there, demand the family that's lived there for generations show them an Israeli court-approved deed, which of course they didn't have because they were there before Israel, and eventually have the Palestinian family evicted, and that's what's happening now. Or, as the state of Israel bulldozes over centuries-old olive groves in the West Bank, which was a huge livelihood for extended Palestinian families. Or as the state of Israel confiscates swaths of land all over the West Bank, naming them Area A, Area B, Area C, and penning the people in. Or as the state of Israel creates separate roads in the West Bank so that Jewish settlers can drive around and avoid the Arab villages on their way to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and Haifa. They built an apartheid wall, an ugly cement wall that separates families in the occupied territories from the rest of Palestine. Here's the irony. On the Arab side, the wall looms big, ugly, gray, with graffiti scrabbled all over it, trash at the base, and barbed wire on top, and watchtowers poking out from which Israeli soldiers watch over the prisoners, the Arabs. On the Israeli side of the wall, you don't even recognize it because they pimped out the wall with cool landscaping, shrubs, flowers, and a sidewalk. Israel made this wall into a prostitute, getting ready for her next customer, covering up her used body with a distracting leopard print dress and cheap perfume. If you're a Palestinian born and raised in the West Bank, your family has been there for generations, check this out. Although the Mediterranean Sea is only 45 minutes drive from you, you have never seen it, because Israel won't issue you a permit. There is no freedom of movement. Every place outside of a few West Bank villages mean humiliating checkpoints and permits, including a hopeful visit to the sea. But if you're a Jew born and raised in, let's say, Sydney, Australia, and decide to move to Israel into a settlement near Ramallah, the sky's the limit. You can have coffee at Starbucks in Jerusalem, meet a friend for sushi in Haifa, and then go clubbing in Tel Aviv, no problem. If this isn't apartheid, I don't know what is. They have done an excellent job of manipulating the narrative, telling the occupation story their way, so that every time they bomb or bulldoze homes and land, they do it in self-defense to protect their existence. This affluent country with the fourth most powerful military and probably one of the best intelligence spy machines in the world that receives billions of military aid from the US every year has Americans convinced that the Palestinian man in Bethlehem who has to apply for a permit to go to his chemotherapy appointment, he is a terrorist. Or the Palestinian woman who has to give birth in the taxi while waiting in line to cross a checkpoint to get to the hospital, she is a terrorist. Or the little boy from Gaza walking around with a bucket, collecting whatever broken toys he can pick up from the rubble of his home, he is a terrorist. The most successful and devastating thing that Israel has accomplished is this, the unapologetic belief that the existence of Israel is so critical that it trumps the dignity and humanity of Palestinians. They can drop bombs flagrantly over Palestinian homes and bodies with impunity, because the existence of Israel and the Jewish people is more important than the existence of the Palestinians. That is Israel's message to the world, and with the unwavering support of the US, it has been successfully heard loud and clear. But despite the lesson I learned from my mother when I was 4, or the decades watching Israel encroach on more Palestinian land, I have hope. I am old enough to remember when the bricks came down from the Berlin Wall. I remember when South Africa decided to confront and disassemble the policy of apartheid. I recall last year's summer of rage and people protesting in the streets after the world watched a black man suffocate to death under the knee of a police officer. Individual voices collectively make change happen. I have hope that we can make change happen for Palestinians. I have hope that the world will look at Palestinians not as the freedom fighters of the 1980s or the guerrillas of the 1990s or the terrorists of post 9/11 or as what they call us today collectively, Hamas, but as mothers and fathers and students and children and people with hopes and dreams like all of us have. That we don't deserve to be bombed and murdered as the world looks away. And I'm in sales, so I always like to leave 3 calls of action. Yes. 3 ways to make your voices heard. Number 1, keep talking about Palestine. Post about it, don't be afraid to have a conversation about it. And most important, don't let the "it's so complicated" argument keep you silent. Ask yourself, as a human being, how do I feel about watching people being evicted from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah? Just the same that happened as countless Palestinians were evicted from their homes in Hebron years ago and all over Palestine. How do I feel about watching families annihilated by bombs in Gaza? That is worth talking about. Number 2, make a donation to a Palestinian charity that will help those in need. My favorites are UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Organization that completely supported my mother's family in Beirut. If it wasn't for that organization, all 10 of her siblings would not have gotten medical care or support or school, and thank God they all have a great life ahead of them because of this amazing organization. The Palestine Children's Relief Fund and Islamic Relief USA. There are countless others. I also like the ABC, the Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, and the IMEU. They're both great organizations that track American policy, law, and media towards Arabs in Palestine and works towards making change. And then finally, get involved by calling a representative to support a bill introduced in the House of Representatives by McCollum, HR 2590, the Palestinian Children and Families Act. Keep the pressure on our elected officials to come to their senses and start leading with humanity. This struggle has been real.